All right, so we're about there. I want to revisit the kind of roundup that we did Friday, that I recorded Friday, just so you understand. The main deal here is like I trust your ability to do problems of these types more than I trust your ability to know when each type should be done, right? That's kind of the hard part, is knowing which pattern to use for what. So let's talk about that. Mendelian genetics, and you might see something that's simple Mendelian. That just means the thing you knew how to do already. The thing where there's just one gene controlling one trait, and there's only two alleles that exist for it, and one's dominant and one's recessive. That's Mendelian genetics. Our first non-Mendelian pattern was sex-linked. Now, sex-linked is not one. I mean, I want in your brains, when you take the end of course test, the state test for this class, if they show you a pedigree or something, and there's a disorder that almost all males are getting it and very few females, you should be thinking in terms of sex linked. But I'm not going to make you recognize that. We're just going to work with these three examples. If you see baldness, color blindness, or hemophilia in a genetics problem, that's what it is. And you need to switch to that X, big H, or whatever letter, B for baldness, or whatever you want to use. But like, it's the one where you have to write the sex chromosomes in and then the superscript of those. Does that make sense? Baldness, hemophilia, color blindness, those are the only examples you will see in genetics problems you have to work. Then your first twofer was codominance and multiple alleles. Codominance, where the two different alleles in a heterozygote both show up separately. You're going to see if it's color, you're going to see both colors separately, speckled or striped or whatever. If it's, and then multiple alleles is where it's not that you get more than two, it's that there were more than two to choose from. And there was one human trait that we looked at that had both of those, which was what? What's the human trait that shows multiple alleles and codominance? Blood type. Good. So that's the main example we'll have with that. Although I might ask you questions about codominance, like codominance versus incomplete dominance, for example. Then we had another twofer, which was polygenic and epistasis. If it's controlled by more than one gene, it's polygenic. A lot of polygenic traits also show epistasis, where one of those genes messes with another, most commonly by covering it up. And the human trait that shows that is simple enough for us to work with is which one? Because it only has two genes. The real eye color pattern is the OCA2 gene on one chromosome, GEY gene on the other, one causing brown and not brown, the other one causing green and blue. Epistasis, that part is that the brown one covers up the other one. Finally, Friday was incomplete dominance. That's the one where, and this one, so far, these three, you kind of know what examples I'm going to use. This is the one where you need to be looking out for the blend. This is the one where I'm not going to tell you exactly what the example is. It might be color. It might be something else. If you see a really tall individual mating with a really short individual and all the offspring are medium height, you should be thinking incomplete dominance. If, white mates with purple and all the offspring are light, whitish purple blend, that's incomplete dominance. And that's where you start using the two capital letters, one with the mark and one without, right? Not upper and lower case letters. That'll fool you. So it's a matter of knowing which one to do with. Okay? Any questions about that? Good. Let's talk about our last thing, which has to do with genetic disorder. We've sort of talked about genetic disorders briefly when we talked about the one really weird one, the one that just requires one cell to get a DNA mutation, which was cancer, if you'll remember. But most genetic disorders are different from cancer. Where do you get most genetic disorders? If you have one, where did it probably come from? Cystic fibrosis or hemophilia. Where'd you get it? Your parents. Yeah, it was in your family's DNA, and that mutation was probably already there and got passed down to you. Exactly right. quite different from an infectious disease, right? Which you can get from another person or get transferred from person to animal to person. It's different. It's a genetic disorder is the kind of thing that is present. It's a DNA mutation present in every cell in your body because your parents gave it to you. Some genetic disorders, some genetic mutations are more serious than others. When we start to talk about the really serious ones, though, my students who are good critical thinkers tend to start asking questions like, hey, if this is a genetic disorder, if this is a mutation that causes people to die, why is it still there? Doesn't evolution, natural selection, doesn't that stuff mean that diseases like this should go away? Shouldn't they be getting weeded out of the population if they're that serious? And that's a really good question. We are going to give a partial answer to that question today. Part of the answer, a small part of the answer is that the really serious genetic disorders are often recessive. And that just means that you can carry one allele for it and not have the bad effects of the gene. But that's not the whole story. Because even then, sure, if it's recessive, that means it can skip a couple generations, right? It can hang out and hide in people, and then if the wrong two people have kids and both of their recessive alleles wind up in the kid, then the kid has the disorder. But even with that, you would think it wouldn't take very many generations for that thing to weed itself out of the population, to weed itself out of the gene. There's something else going on here. So that leaves and left scientists with a question. Is, if it's, and there are certain disorders we're talking about here, the ones that maybe are there's a strong possibility that the person who has the disorder dies before reproductive age. I mean, right there, you would think, how did that even get a foothold, right? Tay-Sachs disease, a disease where two recessives come together in a kid, and the kid typically does not make it past 3 or 4 years of age. That's weeding itself out, right? If the kid can't reproduce, that's the end of that allele. And yet, millions of cases of Tay-Sachs exist. So where did it come from? How did it ever get that kind of foothold in our population? That's the question. And the first clue to the answer is that, well, a lot of those genetic disorders tend to be very much based in ethnic populations. Like, it matters who your ancestors were, which disorders you're at risk for. Certain disorders only show up in, people of European descent. Certain disorders only show up in people of Asian descent. Certain disorders only show up in people of African descent. In fact, it was one of the ones that only shows up in Africans and African Americans that started us on the path to understanding. Question so far? So the question we're asking is, how did something that's genetic and fatal and often kills before reproduction, how did it ever get to any kind of level in a population when it should be weeding itself out? So the answer has to do with, first of all, of course, heterozygotes are key here. Since the things are recessive, we're looking at heterozygotes who don't show the disease, but carry it. So, of course, they don't suffer from Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis. Or in the case of the African population, the one they zeroed in on was, and you might have heard of this one, sickle cell. It used to be called sickle cell anemia. I think it's just called sickle cell disease now. Raise your hand if you've heard of that one, sickle cell. It's a weird one. It it's a very small mutation. It's only one wrong letter, only one wrong DNA base. And yet it makes your hemoglobin, which is the protein that carries oxygen in your red blood cells. It makes your hemoglobin twist up under certain circumstances. Your red blood cells basically just oxygen trucks, right? They just carry oxygen. They're kind of nice and donut shaped because they lose their nucleus. They're donut shaped, very smooth for slipping through like tiny little capillaries and stuff. Well, what happens when people with sickle cell exercise is that the oxygen deprivation causes their red blood cells to collapse into, this is the sickle part, into sort of a half moon shape, sort of a crescent shape, that actually causes them to not slip through capillaries anymore. That causes them to clog up blood vessels, incredibly painful, and can be fatal. So that's a big deal if you're recessive for sickle cell. If you have the two, let's call them big S is healthy and little s is sickle cell, right? We thought it was a simple Mendelian situation there. Well, what they were looking for is somebody got the bright idea of, hey, what if, okay, yeah, sickle cell's bad, but what if being heterozygous for sickle cell is somehow actually an advantage? And what if that advantage somehow outweighs the negative effects of every once in a while having a kid with sickle cell? What if being heterozygous for sickle cell protects you against something else? Anybody know the story? Anybody know what it protects against? What heterozygotes for sickle cell, what their advantage is and was? Basically, and there's two other stories for two other different populations I've got for you. Heterozygotes, the mechanism we've seen a fair amount now is if the heterozygous individual is resistant to a disease, an infectious disease, right? Not genetic, but infectious disease that's really, really, really bad in that particular population. There's really only one choice in the history of Africa for like #1 killer disease. Anybody know? Malaria. Yeah, malaria is a terrible disease, one that we really don't even yet have a cure for. You can sort of treat it, but the treatments are kind of lousy. It's a disease that kind of sticks with you for life. It's easily the #1 killer in history as far as infectious diseases go. AIDS made a pretty good showing in the 90s and the 2000s, but historically, nothing touches malaria. Well, the one thing that apparently has protected Africans against malaria in the past is if you're heterozygous for sickle cell. Because it turns out it's not exactly just simple Mendelian. Turns out heterozygotes have a little bit of weirdness in their red blood cells. Just enough that the malaria parasite that likes to move in to your red blood cells, it doesn't like them. You don't have sickle cell, but your red blood cells are just weird enough to repel the malaria parasite. You see how that would work? I can draw a very simple diagram that can help. Remember, we're going to use S as healthy, and the little s as sickle cell. And let's just say we've got a mom and a dad who are both heterozygous for sickle cell. You remember the Punnett square for two heterozygotes, right? You remember the odds of their offspring being each way? So let's say this is that perfect instance when the odds come out exactly like you think they're going to. And we've got 2 girls and 2 boys. If it comes out just like the Punnett square, how many of those kids are going to be big S, big S? I did. You're right. Is that unconscious? I don't know. I meant 2 squares. How many of those kids does the Punnett square say will be big S, big S? One. So let's say that's this kid. How many does it say will be little s and have sickle cell? Also one. And how many should be heterozygous? Two. Now imagine those kids having to live in Africa. Well, first of all, this kid has a problem. And we'll go worst case here and say that that kid does not live to reproductive age out of the gene pool, right? But this kid also has a problem. What's this kid's problem? Kids could very likely get malaria and is more likely to die from it. So let's say that kid doesn't make it to reproductive age. Now you have two kids that win two ways, right? They don't have sickle cell and they're resistant to malaria. They're going to do great. They're going to have more babies, certainly, than these two kids. And probably more babies than other families that don't have that trait in there. And before long, we got a natural selection situation that's making that little s go way up in frequency. So that's how it happened. That's why a certain percentage of Africans carry this allele. A certain percentage of African Americans still carry it. Yes, it's going away because there's no malaria here. But it's a fairly slow process, right? It takes hundreds of years. For a long time, that was the only example we had. I don't know if nobody thought to look any further, like for maybe like colonial reasons, or like, you know, this is something that happens to that population, not to us. But sure enough, eventually they find that people of Western European descent, we got one, at least one. Whoa. This is hard. This is hard. Oh, wait. Just not very smart. Western Europeans, cystic fibrosis is one of those fatal genetic disorders that has a foothold in our population. But yeah, pretty much just people of Western European descent. And that is because a particularly devastating period in Western European history
Jordan Espinosa, would you come to stop this, please?
Involved typhus, a disease that killed millions of people. And it turns out that carriers of cystic fibrosis, people who are heterozygous for it, don't get typhus. If you're Eastern European or of Eastern European descent, that's the one that's the heartbreaker disease, Tay-Sachs, or kids tend to not live past 3 or 4. Well, tuberculosis is the answer. That in the history of Eastern Europe, there have been particularly vicious outbreaks of TB, and being heterozygous for Tay-Sachs protected against that. So that is one answer to how fatal genetic disorders can get a foothold. Basically, natural selection favoring heterozygotes for a recessive allele that can kill you if you have two. Worth differentiating here, if you don't know already, which ones are the genetic disorders and which ones are the infectious diseases. Be a good thing to keep straight, just a thought. Yuri.
So why is it that dominant allele will cause malaria and typhus and not?
It's not the dominant allele that's doing it, it's the recessive. That's why. Because having one recessive, and I can only speak to sickle cell because I know the story there, having one recessive allele for sickle cell, but not the other one, makes enough of your red blood cells funky that the malaria parasite doesn't like them enough to move in. So you're immune, not because of the dominant allele, but because of the recessive.
So the recessive allele basically takes too much space in the malaria that has to be.
Maybe, or it does something to the surface of the cell that the malaria doesn't like and can't trick its way inside. I'm not sure. But I know it makes it basically inhospitable. Yeah, which tells you sort of that this isn't a simple dominant and recessive. It's not completely recessive if it causes some of your red blood cells to be weird. So it's more of an incomplete dominance or co-dominance, but still, that's what's going on. at least in those cases. And so it's pretty likely that, there are more cases like this in these and other genetic populations. Questions? Past DNA, which is our next two chapters, past that we'll get into evolutionary biology. And this stuff will be more common where we look at things and think, well, how did that get there? Like, what advantage did that give a population that stuck? Because anything you see in you or a surviving organism, at some point was a mutation. At some point it was something new and it stuck around because it was an advantage. I got sample essay questions for you. These will be due Wednesday, no matter what. I say no matter what, you know why, right? You have no idea what's happening tomorrow. One of two things. ACT happens, you're not at school. ACT doesn't happen, you are at school. Either way, this is due Wednesday and the test is Wednesday. If you're not here, I'm not going to throw much at you. Like probably a pre-assessment like you're used to, no big deal. Maybe a short video from me. No. If we are here, we'll be starting the next chapter in class. Probably guided reading or something. Do it in a couple days. We're there.